and welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Terrific. How are you?
I'm great. It's just that I'm kind of under the weather.
Very sorry about that, and I also gather, by the way, that by extension, even your family is under the weather.
That's correct, yes.
But you know, at least as a consolation, you look hugely terrific.
More kudos to you, my friend. Yeah. A warm welcome to you, all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka himself. And today we'll be taking your questions on democracy in Africa. Shaka, right away, let's maybe start in the DRC. We have a new president-elect in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Your thoughts, sir?
We have a new president-elect in the DRC, but of course, as you know, not everyone is happy, including the African Union chairman, Rwandan President, Major General Paul Kagame.
Interesting. It's funny that you say that. One of our first comments is from the DRC. Somebody wants to know what you make of Africa Union's involvement. His name is Derek in Sibiona. What do you make of Africa Union's involvement in the DRC?
I think that the involvement is good. Especially if, in fact, the involvement would have started at the beginning, especially when they are organizing elections and all that kind of stuff. If they had, in fact, come up with a specific definition that in order for an election to be accepted by the African Union or the member states of the Continental Union, they need to meet certain specific thresholds. But for the manner in which the African Union tried to react or respond to the results from Kinshasa, you know, yes, they did have some concerns, and they were probably right to have those types of concerns because that was like a reflection of a big segment of the Congolese people. The problem is the choice of the particular individual that was going to be the mediator. There are a lot of people who would have said, probably quoted former U.S. President Barack Obama. He could have said, given that kind of task, that that was probably above his pay grade. The reason I'm trying to say that, I'm looking at Rwandan President Paul Kagame. When it comes to democracy, there are a lot of people who will tell you, to be very honest with you, that that should have been above his pay grade, because the last time people will say they checked, there is really no democracy that you could talk about in Rwanda. If you look at the type of elections that they have been holding in Rwanda under Kagame's rule, there are a lot of questions to be asked, really. And then when you look at the fact that his country has also been involved militarily in that particular region, and that in fact he even has the distinction of having helped to have a president rule that country in the name of Laurent Desire Kabila, the father of President Joseph Kabila, back in 1997, if I remember correctly. That was the result of a Paul Kagame having led his army in cooperation with other armies like Uganda, like Angola and some other armies, to the extent that they overthrew a government which was led by Mobutu Sese Seko Wazabanga, and installed another individual called Laurent Desire Kabila to be president of that particular country. But this was not an election. Yes, he should take credit for having done that, but then let's face it, I think that he should also accept the fact that things have changed. Society is not static, it is dynamic. If you look at, for example, the mapping report of the United Nations, there are some allegations to such an extent that, in fact, some commentators have suggested that if that particular report, for example, were to be heard or tabled in a court of law, that Kagame, as president of Rwanda, probably could have in fact been accused with either genocide or acts of genocide.
In Congo?
In Congo, even though, of course, Kagame denies that, denies those charges. So I don't think that when you look at the manner in which he tried to mediate the situation in the DRC, I don't think he was the right person, frankly, to try to do that.
I like the fact that, yeah, you've sort of brought that historical and political context, but we're looking at it from the geopolitics of that region. There's a lot of people who argue that President Kagame perhaps suffers from a deficit of democracy in his own country. Was he really the right person to send to, or trying to mediate in the situation in the Congo? Or is Mr. Fawaki, the AU chairperson, oblivious to the fact of what's going on in the Congo?
I think that there are people who will say that the message probably was actually right on the money. It was right, it was correct, but that the messenger by the name of Paul Kagame was a wrong messenger. That when you look at the context of democracy, if you are living in a democratic kind of glass house, that you should not really feel that you have the luxury of throwing stones, because those stones could actually be sent back to you. And if they do, you know what would happen. But I think, having said that, there is no excuse why Africa or DRC itself should not, in fact, organize elections whose results, at the end of the day, reflect the will of the people, not the will of the individual who announces those results or the will of the people who count the vote.
But Shaka, maybe to push back a little bit, a lot of Congolese are saying that some of the results reflect the will of the people. Even the Constitutional Court to vote sort of agrees with their decision or what they've been talking about for a while.
You are right. When you look at the different opinions that obtain in that part of the world, I think that it should be said that people are entitled to their different types of opinions. But that does not necessarily mean that they are entitled to their different sets of facts. And when we talk about the Constitutional Court, yes, you're right, the Constitutional Court actually called it. It dismissed Martin Fayulu's petition. But people will also tell you that when it comes to the Constitutional Court in the Democratic Republic of Uganda, of the Congo, including perhaps the entire Great Lakes region, those constitutional courts, or Supreme Courts, as you call them, are not necessarily independent. Those types of courts are subordinate to the executive who obviously is reflected in the incumbent president.
But how is it different from, for example, the United States here? We have a Supreme Court that has literally been taken over by a conservative group of judges, all appointed by the president. How different is that? If you're trying to make that argument on the Congo, would it, if somebody made the similar argument about the United States, the composure of the U.S. Supreme Court, would that make a difference?
Well, I think that you will really be on very shaky grounds, because there are situations in history where people who have actually been judges who have been appointed by individual presidents have actually gone on to call it or cast their vote in a manner that is a reflection of their conscience, as opposed to a reflection of who appointed them.
Now, what makes you think that it's any different from the Congo? These judges could have followed the law, and the fact that Mr. Fayulu did not adduce enough evidence in court.
You know, I think that I'm not in a position, for example, to argue that court in a court of law, because I happen not to be, first of all, a trained lawyer. I also happen not to have, in fact, looked at the evidence that you are alluding to. But one thing that is very clear is that there is the Catholic bishops in the Democratic Republic of the Congo who command enormous respect, who also appear to be perhaps one of the few institutions in that country that is broadly respected, and that it had actually come with a different point of view. I am also told that when you look at the other evidence that has actually been seen, for example, I don't know whether you are able to read an article in the Financial Times of London. They even used what they characterize as forensic evidence, analyzing the data that was in fact available to them and reached a totally different conclusion. So I think that I am not going to waste your time or the time of audience arguing this case. All I can say is that there are very, very outstanding questions regarding the election results in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is also very interesting, by the way, that the ruling coalition led by President Joseph Kabila lost the presidency so badly, but for some reason actually won a majority, not simply a majority, but in fact a landslide when it comes to the election of the National Assembly. And so I would like to think that surely if they could not vote for the president, the candidate of the ruling party, I don't see honestly why they found it very easy to vote for a huge landslide of individuals representing that same particular party that lost the presidency. So your call, is probably as good as the evidence. And where is the evidence? I don't think the evidence, from what I see, pretty much really seems to have been the basis for reaching the decision as to who actually won this presidency. I have also even heard, by the way, that a man like Martin Fayulu was supported largely by what you would call multinational corporations, that he was supported by countries like former colonial ruler Belgium, that he was supported by the French and what have you, and yet a person like Tshisekedi, who happened to have credentials from his father, Etienne Tshisekedi, that was a man who was perceived to be a Congolese nationalist, and that therefore there are some people who may in fact have been able to vote for him on the basis of saying, look, this is a Congolese nationalist, I think we should go with him, because if we go with Martin Fayulu, we will probably go with allies of those who actually may be responsible for having assassinated our hero, Patrice Emery Lumumba.
Good point, good point. Let's follow up with two comments. One from Alien Abarukundo. Do you think the West should continue to influence the outcome of elections in Africa? And second comment, Otomeri Kayambo. How did imperialist countries intervene in African politics?
I think, first of all, when you talk about influence, how the West influences Africa and what have you, it is really up to Africans themselves, the African people, to be able to gain or regain their confidence and their dignity so that they can assert themselves, and be in control and call the shots when things like Africa come on the table. I don't think that Africans should consider themselves as victims, really. I think Africans should assert themselves and be the giants on their own continent.
How do you respond to this comment from Muhammad Hassan? Africans are always a total a tool for Western nations and have no political transformation because all African leaders sustain the power since their life ends?
I don't really think that that person can prove his allegation that Africans are this or that. I think that one could probably talk about some African individuals in the form of African leaders or African rulers, some might say. Yes, they have actually been, in a sense, sellouts to the extent that they have actually been or have been fitting a category that is said in Swahili, you would say nyampara, that they have actually fit that category of rulers who basically reflect and promote the interests of foreign policies that actually reflect the interests of other people rather than their own people, the Africans. So again, I think that it is up to the African people to be able to step up to the plate and pressure the people they consider to be their leaders to indeed reflect their own African concerns and needs.
We seem to be getting a lot of comments on the issue of democracy. I think this is what rallies a lot of young people across the continent. Let's go to another comment along the same lines. He says, is democracy a kind of Western colonial policy that is forced upon Africans?
On the contrary, I don't think that democracy is owned by any particular individual, even though when you read history, especially Western history, you will discover that the type of governorship that we call democracy may have in fact originated in modern day Greece. And to be honest with you, democracy was supposed to be an improvement over the manner and the types of governorship, of governance that obtained at the time. Democracy, when you think about it, has some tenets that are not really unique to any particular culture, any particular geography, any particular race, any particular religion. You have tenets, sincerely, which are universal, to such an extent that they can actually be regarded as a universal type of language. For example, Paul, when you talk about fairness, where I come from in Cavalry, there is no doubt that in our community, fairness was considered to be a positive value. Justice. When you talk about justice, you talk about accountability. When you talk about freedom of expression, for example, these were supposed to be community values. They were definitely not meant to be monopolies controlled or serving the interests of the Western world.
Speaking of the Western world, let's go to another comment from Amos Chisisi. Western countries should stay away from African politics, and they must stop using fake bishops in the DRC. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that Amos is probably doing a little bit of exaggeration here, because frankly, I don't know whether he has that capability, for example, of knowing that those bishops he's describing as being fake are indeed fake. He has to come up with the evidence that makes him think that way. He cannot, I think, be allowed to really generalize to the extent that he actually ended up perhaps using a sort of abusive language, or a language that is environmentally and socially unpleasant and unfair to some of those individuals who may in fact be very sincere about the opinion that they hold.
How about Wilson Mbao? Why is the church busy with the politics instead of preaching the good news in Congo?
Well, first of all, when you are a member of a church or you are a bishop, it does not necessarily mean that you abdicate your responsibility as a citizen of that particular country, society, or community. And so if you're a citizen, and in addition to that, you also hold an office or a job, it also means that you have a right to own an opinion, especially if that opinion contributes to the potential well-being of that particular society.
Shaka, somebody, Eric Amott, says you quoted the Financial Times of London, but this particular publication forces continue to exploit the Congo and its people. Sorry to say, Shaka, the Catholic Church is part of that too.
I don't know. Unfortunately, I think unlike that particular individual, I do not have that kind of evidence. And I'm not in the business, frankly, of speculating or simply calling out a particular media organization simply because that particular media organizations may in fact belong to the British.
Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Zimbabwe. There is a lot at stake in Zimbabwe. We thought with the election of President Emmerson Mnangagwa, we're going to see a new Zimbabwe. You and I were there covering the elections. But since then, nothing really much has happened on the ground. Riots are all over the country. People are protesting against the cost of fuel, the cost of food, the cost of living there has actually shot through the roof. Your thoughts on what's happening in Zimbabwe?
Zimbabwe, of course, as you know, is a very, very complex situation because, yes, you did have changes in terms of the man at the political helm of the Zimbabwean society, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, being replaced by a former colleague, ally, and mentee, actually, Mr. Mnangagwa, as it were. But unfortunately, nothing much has changed, and partly because there are people who think that the elections that we witnessed were not really elections, that those, in fact, elections were, in their words, not mine, selections. But the other thing also, which is very, very important, Paul, is for people to know that Zimbabwe happens to be under enormous sanctions. For example, Zimbabwe happens to be under sanctions from the United States of America. The United States of America happens to wield veto power, for example, on some of the Bretton Woods institutions that would be responsible to provide or lend some monies to the government of Zimbabwe. And I'm talking about the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The United States is the only country that actually wields a veto. And those sanctions, I think, let's face it, if you talk about them, if you look at those sanctions and what they can actually do, I think they can help us to explain why Zimbabwe is where it is right now. And as a matter of fact, you know that there is this annual business meeting in Switzerland, in Davos. In fact, I was reading a statement by the president of the Republic of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, actually appealing or urging the West, and in particular the United States, essentially really to end these sanctions, because Zimbabwe, at least according to him, seems to be on the right track.
Let's cross over to West Africa. Let's go to Abdullah Abdul. Hello, Shaka. I'm watching from London, UK. Today, it made 1 year since a former football star turned politician held state power in Liberia. What do you make of his 1 year in office? Where is Liberia today?
I think about the jury is still really out when it comes to Liberia, and we are talking about, of course, a former international soccer star, George Weah. I think we need to give him a little bit of time just before we begin doing the sort of political post-mortem. I think that we should be a little bit patient and look at some of the policies that he has put in place and how some of these policies eventually, you know, either produce results or at least in terms of whether or not they can actually make a difference. So I don't think that it would be really time for me to weigh in that particular case. Give me a couple of months and what have you, and ask that question again, and I promise you that I will do the best I can in order to answer it in a manner that will also be fair to George Weah, depending on, of course, what he said and whether he's been able to, you know, to walk the talk. Because a lot of politicians, as they say, when they are running for office, they do it in poetry. They promise heaven on earth. But when they come to the business of governing, someone will say they in fact end up governing through prose. Because, you know what? They have to deal with the socio-economic, political reality that they actually find in place. And so I think that it's very easy for politicians to talk the talk, but when it comes to walking that talk, my friend, they have to look at the realities that they have to deal with.
What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow in Straight Talk Africa, it is very interesting that you ask this, especially given that we almost exhausted the issue of democracy. We are actually going to do a bit of what I would call, or at least what is called in the American university curriculum, when they talk about the basics of a discipline or a lesson, they say it is economics 101. And tomorrow, we are going to attempt to talk about democracy in the context of democracy 101.
Very interesting.
We are probably going to find out some various definitions of what is democracy. There are some definitions that say, for example, democracy is the art of all possibilities. Another definition can also say democracy is about really people. It's about who gets what, when, where, and why. There are other definitions also who will say democracy actually means the art of making the impossible possible, and the art of making the possible sometimes impossible. And so we're going to be looking at democracy in that broad context.
So very briefly, we have a final comment from Makel Salfas Nwagawa. Why is the Western world interested in African politics? And real quickly, let's go to, first go for that one.
The Western world is very much interested in African politics because, let's guess it, I mean, let's be honest. When you think about life requires resources. And the last time I checked, Africa perhaps holds what you would consider to be enormous resources that will help people to live good lives. Africa has all the minerals you can think about. It has the land that could in fact be the breadbasket of the world. That's the reason why the West is interested in Africa, and it's not limited to the West. What about Asia? Talk about China. Talk about India. Talk about Turkey. Talk about Brazil. The entire world is interested in Africa because Africa has a lot of resources that can make a difference in people's lives.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Shaka Extra Time. We look forward to having you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, thank you so much from Washington. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.